Good afternoon. Welcome to the International Association of Laboratory Schools annual conference. We're so honored to have this gathering here at Teachers College. It's a wonderful opportunity for us all to share our stories, ideas, and goals for the future of our schools. And the conference theme of the three R's, reflect, reframe, and reform, dovetails so well with what we always try to do at TC. We think our approach here takes the lab school idea into the mainstream public school arena, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. Think about that in a reflecting, reframing, reforming mode. I think it's imperative that more schools of education and, in fact, entire universities work in strategic ways with their local schools to bring the best of what we know through the university assisted model to improve schools. And I think it's one of the most important contributions that universities today, everywhere throughout the world, can make to future generations. It's very fitting that this discussion take place at TC, because TC has had university-assisted public schools throughout its history. The first was in 1902, the Spire School, which was at 126th in Amsterdam, and you can still see the building is now a nursing home, but it still says Spire School. And it was a full-service community school in the settlement house mode. It served immigrant children and families by providing, I quote, some of the first essentials of wholesome living, as its first principle said. And these essentials included health and sanitation and instruction, library services to the neighborhood, a space for community group clubs to gather, a staff that included 2 social workers, a commitment to keep the building open from 8 in the morning till 10 at night, and of course a focus, as it was TC, on excellent instruction. It's a great sadness that the Spire School is no longer with us, and when I hear about community schools and full-service schools and other people claiming that they had this idea, I remind them that it was 1902 when Teachers College had this idea. We've established other university-assisted public schools, the Heritage School in 1996, which is a high school in East Harlem founded with the New York City Board of Education, and of course, as you know, the Teachers College Community School in 2011, also with the Board of Education. We also had laboratory schools. I don't know how many of you knew of the Lincoln Institute, which was originally the Agnes Lincoln School, which was a true lab school. There's also, of course, Horace Mann, a famous private school that was located in the corner of this building on Broadway and 120th Street before it moved up to Riverdale. Eventually, Horace Mann and Lincoln merged into some sort of institute, and Lincoln was no longer a school. So we've had our experience with both laboratory schools and with university-assisted public schools. And there have been so many leaders at TC, so much intellectual and philosophical attention to the idea of being agents of change in local schools. Of course, our most illustrious past president and scholar Lawrence Kremen saw education as a tool for social change, and education should extend, he argued, beyond the classroom to encompass families, religious institutions, communities, museums, and the media. He argued for a very encompassing definition of education, a holistic definition of education, which I think encompasses the idea of the school being the center for so much broader education in informal as well as formal settings. And then, of course, Professor Emeritus Edmund Gordon, a living legend at Teachers College, who was the founding director of our Institute of Urban and Minority Education, who has devoted his life to advancing the idea that positive educational outcomes depend on more than what we learn in school. His research has shown that disadvantaged children need enriched environments and a range of supports and services. He's called this approach supplemental education. We're now all calling it comprehensive educational opportunity, but it's the idea of the school and the community together serving children and families in this broader sense. And these visions of a holistic approach to the development of children and communities inform so much of TC's work in our schools and our neighborhoods, as well as the work of faculty, students, and alumni everywhere, both here and around the world. As a TC graduate myself and returning to the college in 2006, I was, of course, keenly aware of the college's powerful legacy in urban education. I mean, urban education is one of all the fields of education that were founded at TC. When I try to list those fields, because we just had a big anniversary, and gifted education, nutrition education, sex education, nursing education. When I try to list those fields, I always leave one out. And it was the one that mattered most to the person sitting right in front of me in the audience. So I do no longer give the whole list, but any field you can think of, we started here. And it's an advantage being the oldest and the biggest. But we know the challenges are so numerous and sometimes seemingly intractable, and there are no silver bullets. Of course, there are many excellent public schools with committed leaders and teachers, and there are privately managed charter schools which have been very successful, and there are private schools that have been very successful. But the public school system is where 90% of the students in this country are, and more than 90%, I guess. Well, if you take away private. Subtracting the private school population, which is about 11 or 12%, the rest of students in that age group, 90% of them are in public schools, and fewer than 10% are in charters. Only 6% of the children in New York City are in charters, so the public schools are a major part of where our attention needs to focus. And there's a real and urgent need for research-based solutions to the problems of urban education that can have an impact on a broader scale. I think the model of university-assisted public school offers us a way forward here, a bold way forward. It represents not only an effort to improve educational outcomes and provide comprehensive opportunity to students, but to create excellent neighborhood schools, because it's focused on the neighborhood of the university, in which every child flourishes in diverse, intellectually rich environments. And these are schools where many faculty and staff are enthusiastic about sending their children, certainly no small side benefit. If we have schools that need help in our neighborhood, and we have promising research-based solutions, which I don't think you can justify yourself as an education school if you don't, if that's not what you're working on, then we have a moral obligation to do what we can to put our knowledge to work in our own neighborhood. We must. What argument could there possibly be to trying to reach the broader world and not trying to help schools if there are schools that are at need in your own neighborhood? With this imperative in mind, involvement with our public schools has been a special focus of my presidency. And of course, even before that, as Kathy mentioned, as Dean of the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, I helped to spearhead with the university leadership absolutely in the forefront. That was essential. The creation of the Penn Alexander School, a university-assisted pre-K through 8 school, neighborhood public school in Philadelphia, which, by the way, is the best neighborhood public school in Philadelphia to this day. It's been nationally recognized for its innovative curriculum, professional development focus, excellent academic programs, and every year it sends a large majority of its 8th grade graduates to Philadelphia's most selective high schools, including the prestigious Masterman High School and Central High School. Penn Alexander students are now going to college. I don't know that we have the latest statistics. All of them are going to college, and I'll eventually be able to tell you where they're all going to college, but nothing could make us prouder than the success of these children in what was a very disadvantaged neighborhood, West Philadelphia, before Penn's comprehensive community improvement efforts started to take effect. As TC's president, I want to build on the success of Penn Alexander and create a partnership public school and set of schools in Harlem that would be practical and compelling models of a university-assisted school that could inspire other universities to engage in this work. What I think sets the university-assisted school apart from other models of school reform is the way that in which universities partner with mainstream public schools, lending rich interdisciplinary resources from across the university to the enterprise. And this is very important, taking joint responsibility for public school outcomes. This is not a, you know, we're here to dabble approach at all. This is a collective approach where the school and the university and the public school system partner and are collectively responsible for the experiences and the outcomes in that school or set of schools. This model reflects our belief that universities are uniquely positioned to bring leading-edge research and apply their resources in strategic, coordinated, and cost-effective ways. I really want to stress this for human development, especially for children whose educational success is compromised by poverty. I want to stress that cost-effectiveness. It's still a theory because we're focused on trying to understand and gather the outcomes, but if you are paying social work interns with credits, as opposed to dollars that you'd be paying social workers that you might have to raise philanthropically or in a variety of ways. That has to be cost effective. There has to be some economies associated with providing the university-assisted public school model, providing a training ground for practitioners in preparation across all disciplines, education, but of course also health and welfare. There have to be some economies in that, and we're out to find them and demonstrate them and hopefully be a model to other universities. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing at TC and about our model specifically. I know some of you visited TCCS yesterday. Building on our legacy, in 2007 we established the Office of School and Community Partnerships, headed by Dr. Nancy Strime, who I think you've all met. Nancy was my partner at the Penn Alexander School in establishing Penn Alexander, and she's been my partner here at Teachers College. And do not, those of you from other places, decide you want to take Nancy away, because we're not going to let that happen. The office has enabled us to begin a coordinated, comprehensive, and institutional approach to achieve better outcomes in local public schools. Under Nancy's leadership, TC developed a partnership with a group of local pre-K to 12 Harlem public schools. We call this consortium of schools REACH, which stands for Raising Educational Achievement Coalition of Harlem. REACH currently includes 3 elementary schools and 3 secondary schools, and our goal is to expand the program to include 12 schools, at least. We're in discussions with Columbia and with Community District 9 about the possibility of reaching more schools. That's a more ambitious vision, but our plan with the resources that we can envision right now extends to 12 schools, and it leverages the resources of TC and Columbia to provide comprehensive academic, social, and health services that are critical for children to reach their potential. Through REACH, we partner with and coordinate the services of key players, including the Columbia School of Social Work, the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, which does a lot of science work with the kids, the Mailman School of Public Health, and the Medical Center. TC Center for the Professional Development of Teachers provides services as well, and of course the New York City Department of Education, this is a public school, and with partnering community-based organizations in the arts and other fields. Many TC programs and departments that represent the breadth of our fields are involved in TCCS and the REACH partnership. They include early childhood education, elementary inclusive education, art, music, science, counseling, reading, physical education, and nutrition. Our students have opportunities to provide, our own students have opportunities to provide curriculum supports, instruction, and tutoring, and they focus in particular on enrichment activities in critical areas such as literacy, health, and nutrition. TCCS anchors the REACH network, and I'm always thrilled to talk about this school, which has been making an enormous difference in the lives of its little students. We only have the first few grades so far, and in their lives of their families. TCCS moved into its permanent home on Morningside Avenue in 2012. It's led by a dynamic principal, Janine Worrell-Breeden, who comes as a veteran New York City public school administrator, who has created an inclusive culture for the school students and active parent community. If you met Janine yesterday, during the tour of the school, you saw firsthand her passionate commitment to providing the best educational experiences possible to the children. Our intention in founding the school with the New York City Department of Education was to create a true public community school that provided a full-service education. And while we wanted to do this by connecting our work at TC across a variety of fields in a focused, cohesive, and strategic way, in the end, the school is not about us. TCCS is about the families and the communities we serve. It's about creating a public school that advances academic excellence, health and well-being, arts and culture, diversity, parent involvement, and a stronger neighborhood. And by design, the school reflects the dynamic diversity that is Harlem. So this is not about us learning, although we certainly do. We have lots of research going on in TCCS. It's not about TC faculty or Columbia faculty sending their kids there, although they do. We have those families in TCCS. But it's about the children who go there, the children and their families, and what are the outcomes we can best provide for them. It has a unique niche among public schools in the city in that it's both non-selective. It's a neighborhood school, but of course we have to have a lottery because the neighborhood would be too big for this little tiny school, but it's a neighborhood school, and giving preference to students who live in districts 5 and 6 in Harlem, but it has to be open by law to all children in the city to some extent. And it offers it will offer grades pre-K through 8. Our involvement with the school is deep and broad. It reflects the input of TC faculty who offer the best research and teaching in math, science, music, psychology, nutrition, reading, writing, physical education, art, and other fields. Half of the classroom teachers are TC alumni, and they're supported by TC student teachers who every day put into practice curricula designed by our faculty. As they do with our other Reach schools, TC students serve in a variety of roles. They are specialty and pre-service teachers, after-school instructors, literacy interns, and classroom assistants. We have school counseling interns on site who perform educational, psychological, and developmental assessments and provide interventions and counseling as well. And through our programs in education, health, and psychology, we're setting up referral pipelines for TCCS and the other partnership schools to on-campus clinics and services at Columbia and at Teachers College. Another TCCS distinction is that it offers extra classes that aren't available in other public schools, such as nutrition and cooking, engineering, and Spanish for little elementary. And in the hope that spring weather really will come to New York City this year, I think we're beginning to see that, the students are looking forward to planting a garden that will provide fresh vegetables and herbs for the nutrition and cooking program. It's been wonderful and gratifying to see the students at TCCS thriving and achieving impressive outcomes thus far. So, for example, among kindergarten students, 99% completed the 2012-2013 school year at or above grade level in reading and writing using appropriate developmental assessments. Among first grade students, 83% ended the year at or above grade level in reading and writing. In math, 96% of kindergartners and 90% of first grade students ended the year at or above grade level. And next year, we'll have the official city test results for our first group of third graders. TCCS also received high marks from teachers and parents in the Department of Education's annual school survey that rates every school on perceptions of academic expectations, communication, engagement, safety, and respect. Overall, the school has brought many tangible benefits to our students, our community, and just about everyone, to its students, as well as our students, to the community, and just about everyone with a stake in the future of West Harlem. Children and their families have an excellent neighborhood public school of choice that's flourishing. For TC students, it has meant having a public community school a few blocks away where they can get quality experience as a student teacher, researcher, or intern. And the school is a source of community pride and an exemplar of a true partnership among Teachers College, Columbia University, the New York City Department of Ed, and our neighbors in West Harlem. We're delighted with all these benefits, but we're also dreaming bigger. Our dream is, as I said before, that other universities and their partners across the country and across the world will adapt this model, make it their own, to create their own public community schools. We need more schools like TCCS so children can benefit. We hear of this need from the many schools in New York City and around the country who ask us how they can create schools like TCCS. We're always happy to be of assistance and share our experience, but local public schools can't do this alone. This is not going to be replicable with resources that the Department of Ed gives to schools. Our audience is universities. Universities need to lead the way. I can't stress strongly enough the exponential impact of colleges and universities partnering with their neighborhood school. It's an endeavor within the reach of many schools, in many institutions that have education schools and other professional schools, solid research, strategic and coordinated use of resources, and the support of philanthropic investment. Unlike charter schools, the model is financially sustainable. I mean, we don't, charter schools, it looks bright at the moment, but universities have been around since about 1600 or maybe before that. They're going to be here a long time. And in terms of neighborhoods, universities are the most stable neighborhood institutions. I mean, after all, we've been here 125 years. And community-based organizations, as great as they may be, sometimes come and go. Universities stay. We have a stake, a long-term stake in this neighborhood. We're going to be here. We're not going anywhere. We need to put our resources to work here. Let me say a word about the importance of philanthropic partners. For the university model to succeed, we have to engage and involve them deeply in our work. We would not have been able to undertake this effort at TC without their vision and generosity. So among them have been our trustees, John Rosenworld, Lori Tisch, Lacey Evans, alumna Judy Berger, and her husband Robert. But our guiding angel from the beginning is our trustee emerita, Dinnie Morse. Her children are here, Leslie Nelson and Doug Morse. The family has carried on. She believed in this from the moment she sat down with Nancy and me, and she has just been an inspiration as a donor and as a funder who gets deeply involved in our ideas and just makes them that much more exciting. We're also so grateful to foundations, the GE Foundation, and more recently the J.P. Morgan Chase Foundation, which has provided support for our REACH schools. I hope, Gayla, are you here? Gayla Jennings O'Byrne, who is the president of Global Philanthropy at J.P. Morgan Chase, has also been very closely involved in our work with the REACH partnership. These visionary philanthropists and foundations recognize that all relevant stakeholders must collaborate to share our expertise, research, and resources so we may have a real and lasting effect on the quality of public education for the next generation and build stronger communities in the process. I'll leave you with this last thought. Our one university-assisted school will not transform public education or solve the myriad problems confronting urban public schools throughout the country. But I strongly believe that if every university with a school of education and other professional schools were to partner with their local school districts, and in doing so, create hubs of academic excellence, professional development, and family and community engagement, we could generate a rising tide of educational excellence and opportunity that would lift all boats. Thank you.
What I'd like to do today is I want to generate as much conversation and discussion as possible and have all of you involved in this conversation as much as possible. So the format of this panel discussion is going to run as follows. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to speak for about 3 to 5 minutes to give an overview an extended elevator speech, if you will, about their particular university-assisted school, the who, what, when, where, and why, and just give you a little bit of a flavor and an overview, sort of a condensation of the About Us piece. And I'll ask a couple of questions, follow-up questions to them. And we're going to do this for all three panelists. And after that, I'm just going to initiate a general discussion. And my hope is that I get to try out to be Bill Maher by throwing a couple of provocative questions out there and then having our three panelists really talk among themselves and interact with one another. And the only difference is I will not use any profanity or vulgarity. And then after that, we'll open up the floor to your questions and comments. So I would like to start with Beatriz, because your school is actually the one of the longest vintage represented here today. And so I'm really curious as to why Arizona State University chose to adopt the charter school model, and what are the advantages and challenges that you've seen as a result of that?
Sure. So very briefly, I'll just give you a quick overview. Our first campus opened up in 2008, and then our second campus in 2009. Effectively, ASU became involved in chartering a school not because Arizona needed its 551st charter school. In Arizona, it's kind of the Wild Wild West of charter schools, and there's lots of them. But rather because it really fell into part of the Arizona State University's mission to be accessible to the community, to serve as an anchor in the community. And also an interest in really developing the full pre-K through 20 pipeline sort of continuum. So our mission effectively is to ensure that every single one of our students completes college, contributes to their communities, and competes globally. And with that, currently we are serving just over 1,700 students in grades pre-K through 11. We will be growing to grade 12 this fall, so we'll be serving over 2,000 students at that point and graduating our first seniors this in spring of 2015. We are located in two principal geographic locations in the greater metropolitan Phoenix area. One is in central downtown Phoenix, which is really an urban core geographic area, and then the other one is what we call maybe a suburban area, because we're actually in Mesa, Arizona, which is a suburb of Phoenix, although it all sort of blends into each other. The demographics in those two principal locations are very different. Downtown, we serve 70% free and reduced lunch. Or 70% of our students are free and reduced lunch. About 10% of them are special needs students. And they are a majority non-white population, with about 70% being Hispanic, about 12% being African American, and then the remainder kind of being a mix of lots of other populations. In our suburban campuses, we're more like middle to upper income, and we do not have a significant population of free and reduced lunch students, although we do have students from all different kinds of circumstances. And there we are, a majority white population. I think ASU, in serving these schools, really is demonstrating that students, in spite of their life circumstances, can achieve. So students from all backgrounds. So really what we are demonstrating is that regardless of where you live, regardless of what your life circumstances, you can all achieve at the highest levels and be prepared to not just be eligible to attend college, but to actually successfully complete college. And it is through that through the involvement with the schools that we are effectively advancing students as they master concepts rather than based on grade or based on age, and therefore availing them of university resources as soon as they're ready for it, whether that's through an academic apprenticeship experience, courses for college credit, but really advancing students in a very personalized and individualized way to meet them where they're at. So I would say that that is that's a brief overview, and I'm sure we'll get into more discussion around challenges and as well as advantages relative to executing and implementing that program.
So Beatriz, charter schools receive no more than and typically less than the per pupil allotment for district-run schools, while at the same time enrolling student bodies that are often among the neediest in the community. So what are the issues and challenges that you have faced as the CEO in obtaining adequate resources for these schools?
So I'll get back to our sort of two geographic areas. Yes, we have 4 schools, but I like to kind of refer to them in those 2 geographic areas. The other demographic that I didn't share with you is that in our urban campus, we effectively call that our turnaround school. We inherited what was a failing school that was being operated by the Phoenix Elementary School District as strictly a 6 through 8 school. District closed it, and then we opened it as a K-8 initially, eventually adding pre-K and high school grades. In a very sort of short amount of time, we have made some tremendous gains. In the beginning, only a quarter of those students were meeting the standard in math. Only a third of those students were meeting the standard in reading, and 3 years later, we have 2/3 of the students meeting the standard in math, 3/4 of the students meeting the standard in reading, and we've made some tremendous progress in closing the achievement gap with the state. And depending on what grade or content area you look at, in some cases, we've even surpassed the state averages. For a suburban campus, we're actually one of the leading performing charter schools in the state. Our high school is the highest performing high school charter in the state. And so effectively, what we've realized through that process is that it does take more resources. At present, we are funded about $1,200 less per student than what the traditional school districts receive. This is when you're just looking at state funding. If you add federal funding to that, we're actually about $2,200 less per student. The Phoenix Elementary School District gets a fair amount of resources, about $10 million in what is called desegregation funds, and we are not eligible to avail ourselves to that. Charters also cannot avail themselves to a lot of the soft or hard capital fundings. We can't go out to the voters and ask for bonding authority to support extended day activities, what have you. But what we have found is that it does cost more to educate our urban students relative to our suburban students, just because there's so much more, there's a greater need for supplemental education, either after school, on Saturdays, to really help accelerate them at the pace that they need to accelerate to be at grade level or beyond. So it does cost more, but we've made it work largely in partnership with many collaborators in the community, which include certainly Arizona State University, but then we have several cultural and institutions, as well as private corporations and private donors that have made some of these resources available so that we could, in fact, make those kinds of gains.
Could you say a little more about how you're enlisting these partners in meeting the non-educational or instructional needs of the children and families, physical and mental health, parent engagement, how all of those pieces do fit into your model, and how maybe tell an illustrative story of that illustrates how you're enlisting and mobilizing these partners to meet those needs.
Sure. Where we're located, I'll highlight the downtown geographically located campuses first. There we are central to lots of resources in the city, the Phoenix Children's Museum, the Arizona Science Center, several private corporations and entities, and that is our location where we have 70% free and reduced lunch. So a lot of our families do come from poverty and very sort of difficult life circumstances. A lot of our kids are homeless, or our kids are living with relatives rather than the primary parent, have other folks serving as guardians. But effectively, parent engagement is something that was a challenge in the beginning, and what we've done is we require 30 credit hours of volunteer time from the parents, and we don't dictate how that needs to happen. In some cases, it does mean them coming to the school. In other cases, it means them allotting 2 hours of quiet time at home to allow for homework, TV off, radio off. But either way, that is an agreement that parents make when they come. We are not a selective enrollment school. We're also, lottery, first come, first serve. That said, though, we set a level of expectation relative to the type of parent engagement that we desire. With regard to the partners, I think living in downtown, they recognize the importance of having high quality educational options relative to what that does to the economy, but also, what that offers for employees even that come downtown. Even though we're largely a neighborhood school, the majority of our students are from the neighborhood. They value offering a quality high school option in particular. Our elementary schools, they kind of run the gamut in terms of level of quality, but there really isn't a high quality high school in Phoenix Central Downtown that's not selective enrollment. So they value that, and that's largely what I think has enticed them to invest in the school and contribute to it. Plus, our facility is really large, and so we avail ourselves, our facility, to the community. We consider ourselves of the community. We rent, actually I say rent or lease, but actually we don't charge it. We provide space to a local church to hold service in our auditorium on Sundays. The university students use our athletic fields for intramural sports. Some of the university faculty, of course, because there's a heavy level of integration there, have conducted some courses within the context of our walls, even though we have a downtown campus just kitty corner to where the school is located. But I think also making yourself accessible to the community engenders that level of investment and interest.
One final question. How do you harness enough faculty capacity to have a meaningful impact on the academic side of these schools? I mean, I know that Arizona State University is large, but that's still, I would imagine, is calling for a rather large level of faculty involvement to have any kind of meaningful impact in terms of what the university's footprints are.
Yeah, we've taken the approach where whenever we're engaged in a discussion with faculty around a potential, partnership or type of curriculum or research that they want to implement, it has to be value add on both sides. And so it's really just not for the sake of having faculty, but it really has to be meaningful going both ways. And in that way, I would say that it's less about faculty capacity and more about match. And when we do find those, that relevant match, we really leverage that to the fullest. And we're not just engaging with that faculty, but we're engaging with those graduate students, with those university students that are pursuing that particular discipline, and really leveraging those relationships to augment the program that we're trying to implement. And we've found that really goes a long way. Arizona State University is the largest public-run university in the state. We're serving just over 75,000 students. So that really hasn't been an issue for us as of yet. But I think we focus more on match rather than on quantity.
Great. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn to you, Dean Andrews, if I may. Sure. In your role as dean, what makes the Henderson-Hopkins effort in the school and the effort integral to the School of Education, and for that matter, to the rest of the university?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, it's personally an interest of mine. So I've invested a lot of my own professional time, and I think all of these efforts take a commitment from the top. At Johns Hopkins, we're fortunate enough to have a strong commitment from the president, and the president has twisted the arms of other deans, and we have the commitment of other deans at this point. So it does take a commitment at all levels. For us, we have such a rich history in medicine at Hopkins, and no one could possibly imagine Johns Hopkins University and the School of Medicine without the hospital. I mean, it's unimaginable to think about what the entity would be without having a grounded base in the community where it could get its work done. And where what we learn in those hospitals, initially with the first hospital, affects the profession across the state of Maryland and across the United States, and indeed across the world. The Johns Hopkins School of Public Health grew out of the School of Medicine and now has a presence in 120 countries. So for us, this is our hospital. I mean, this is literally, and that resonates within our community. This is an effort, and the university itself was founded under the notion that you had to have clinical expertise along with an academic expertise, and that expertise should first be oriented towards your most needy citizens. So the university and the hospital itself were formed in order to serve the very neediest population within the Baltimore area. So in some ways, we're just recreating the past. As President Furman said, this is not a new concept of university-assisted schools and/or hospitals, for that matter. It's actually implementing them in the 21st century in a way that's sustainable. That's the challenge.
So tell us a little bit more about this school itself and what its characteristics are, its vision, its governing philosophy, and it just opened almost around the same time as Teachers College Community School did, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And go ahead.
Been building a class for a few years, but we just moved into a new facility in January. And we're able to build a new $53 million facility in one of the toughest neighborhoods of Baltimore. And the reason is that that neighborhood had become so isolated and deserted and so dysfunctional. It was in such close proximity to our other anchor institution, being the hospital. And the catalyst for the initial effort, the catalyst, not many people know, is actually one of our surgeons was kidnapped and stuffed into the back of his car in a parking garage that we owned at Johns Hopkins University. Prior to that point, the university's stance on the neighborhood adjacent to it was to wall ourselves off and to have security posts on the corners of the neighborhood and just make sure that, and the neighbors, I live in the neighborhood now, the neighbors literally talked about the wall at Johns Hopkins, and the wall meant you don't come in, and they don't come out. And so the strategy, this school is part of a much larger strategy to re-engage the university in a neighborhood that we had been totally disenfranchised from. And so the notion of universities as anchor institutions and then translating that into our university-assisted schools as the anchor institutions for the redevelopment of the neighborhood is really the catalyst for what we've done. And we're as much committed to a holistic view of the role of this school in the community as we are the academic performance of our students. So where we think about holistic from a developmental standpoint, meaning academic, social, emotional, and physical, you have to also think about these places as holistic in terms of their involvement with housing redevelopment, with their involvement with workforce development. If you don't think about, for us, if we don't think about the community as a whole developing and this being an anchor institution, then we won't progress.
In terms of realizing that vision, both that vision that you've just articulated, on the ground in terms of nuts and bolts, I mean, how is your School of Education working with teachers, the instructional staff, to realize the vision in terms to reflect Hopkins's educational program and philosophy?
So we are the operator for the school. In Maryland, that means we have a contract with the school district. So it's a public school. It's a version of a hybrid charter where we have a contract with the district to actually run the school. So the School of Education at Hopkins, we select the principal, we support and supervise the principal, we select the curriculum and implement the curriculum. We play a role in selecting the teachers, although the teachers are public school teachers. In the end, they're paid by the district. But we also have created the whole model and philosophy. So I'm an early childhood person at heart. So we start with 6 weeks in the school. It's 6 weeks through the 8th grade. And consistent through that progression from 6 weeks to 8th grade is a commitment to a mixed income, diverse population, and a competency-based kind of movement through this holistic approach that we have put together. So for us, it's more than just a university-assisted. It is essentially a university-based laboratory for us, and we have put our name on it as Henderson Hopkins, and that's one of the ways to keep it from going away, is to put your name actually on the building itself. So it's hard to get off.
David, one last question before I turn to Nancy. How do you envision the socioeconomic and racial composition of Henderson Hopkins in 5 years? Especially if, I think we were just talking over lunch about the vision and aspiration of moving toward a mixed income community itself, and the school reflecting that community. So, I mean, what are the opportunities and challenges that you would see this presenting? And of course, the word that springs to mind always is gentrification. So, what are you anticipating and planning for in that regard?
Well, that's a great question, and that's certainly the question that the neighborhood asks us all the time. There's a certain element in the neighborhood that believes that at some point we're going to flip a switch and turn it into a private school. and it will be all faculty. You know, right now we have one faculty person who has a member who has a child at the school in the second grade, and also happens to be the only white kid in the school at this point. So we have a major challenge to think about this redeveloping neighborhood, and it makes you think very holistically. So we backed up prior to opening the school. This bigger initiative had a strategy to look at the housing composition in the neighborhood to make sure that we grounded it first with subsidized housing, subsidized rentals, subsidized home ownership, and fortunately we started with literally a blank slate, a pallet, an empty pallet, because if you've ever been through Detroit or parts of Baltimore, this was in an area where there are literally blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks of empty houses that are boarded up, and most of them burned out and boarded up. So we tore down 7 acres of that to build the school, but around that we grounded it first in subsidized housing in a proportion where the goal is 40 to 60% free and reduced lunch for the school. The socioeconomic mix in the neighborhood needs to reflect that as well. So we're very conscious of what happens when market rate people start moving into the neighborhood, like myself, and what it does to both the composition of the school as well as the composition of the neighborhood, and they go hand in hand. We have already, with the new school opened, and it's a shiny penny in a very difficult neighborhood. If you come into Baltimore from this area, from the north, it's the first thing you see coming into Baltimore, and we overbuilt it on purpose. It's quite a sight to see from the train. But that's the only way we'd think, one of the primary ways we can think about reestablishing that neighborhood. So we put Hopkins' name on it. We built a phenomenal building, and then we basically have said, if you want to, we prioritized and said, if you want to come to this school, you need to live in the neighborhood. And all of a sudden, within an 18-month period of time, we've had a switch in interest in living in this neighborhood that has been night and day. When we moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago, there were a dozen or so houses that had been sitting on the market. Somebody was trying to speculate that they was going to turn. They've been on the market for 4 or 5 years, 20, 30% below other housing values. Now there's a list of people waiting for housing stock to be finished in that neighborhood. So we think it's a promising approach, but the notion is it's more than the school. It's about thinking about the community spaces that you build into these things. We have as much of a focus on the library, the family support area, the gymnasium, the auditorium. All of those things are actually not only available to the community, it was designed so that they're accessible to the community even during the day. So they're not just accessible when we're not using it. It's accessible by design at any time we want the community to be involved.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Nancy Strine. Hi. Susan described Teachers College Community School so well, I feel I could just go right into some questions here. I guess the first question that comes to mind is that in creating a new public school from the ground up, and again, I mentioned that I've witnessed this being done twice at close range. Both times, in this instance, you chose a full partnership with the Department of Education rather than go with a charter or any other model. And so I'm curious as to, based on your experience both at Penn and here at Teachers College, at what you see are the advantages of a partnership school with a district where you're bound by all the district rules and union contracts, and what are the advantages of that model, and what are the challenges?
Okay. Thanks, Jim. Well, it sometimes feels like the $64,000 question, particularly because in New York, when Susan Furman and I first met with Joel Klein to talk about our vision for opening a new public school, he said, well, we're going the charter route here in New York, and then you can have all the freedom you want. Why don't you open a charter school? And we declined because, as Susan said in her remarks earlier, it's our belief and our commitment that for us to be involved in public education, we want to jump feet first into mainstream public education. And we have managed in both the Penn situation and here in New York to to garner some of the flexibilities that one sees in charter schools, but the school is formally managed by the Department of Ed. The teachers are employees of the Department of Ed and belong to the union. And similar to some of what my colleagues have described, we have a role in the selection of the principals, selection of the teachers, the schedule, and the curriculum. And I felt, and we felt, that those were the key areas where the university needed to have a role. And beyond that, if we wanted to play in the public school arena, then we were simply going to have to work within the boundaries of what every other public school has to deal with. It's interesting to me that there's more flexibility in the system than we sometimes imagine. You just have to step up. You just have to try. You just have to ask. You just have to read the contract. In fact, we have not been stymied in important ways so far in what we want to do. We can work within the system. So that's what matters to us. Does it take a little longer? Probably. Are there more stresses in having to cross all of the T's and dot the I's and connect with the right people? I'm sure that's the case. But I have to say that the Department of Ed in New York, as well as the School District of Philadelphia, have been terrific partners. We haven't felt that we are trying to do something that is out of the realm of what they're trying to accomplish as well. So for us, it's worth the challenge.
If you can just give either an overview of that or any specific examples drawn from your experience at TCCS that would illuminate that.
I think to answer that question, I'm going to conflate what went on at the Penn Alexander School, which has at this point has a 13-year history, and at the Teachers College Community School, which at this point is just coming up on its third year. So it's incredibly rewarding to me when we have let me start with our own students, with graduate students. Start as a volunteer, become an intern, start to ask some interesting research questions, and the next thing you know, you have a dissertation that student has written a dissertation that's based on his or her experience as deeply engaged in the school. So I'm very proud when I see our students graduate from Teachers College as well as from Penn who have learned and based their work on their experiences in the school. Here's the flip side. This is a Penn Alexander story. In order to bring the university faculty together with the teachers to address questions of mutual interest, they have to get to know each other, they have to learn to trust each other. And that can be, it can be a slow process, but it's not one that you would want to try to accelerate. It has to be mutually beneficial for the university faculty as well as the teachers. So one of my colleagues at Penn, several of my colleagues at Penn, came into the Penn Alexander School and thoughtfully and sensitively began to engage a group of teachers in questions about early literacy or about math, conceptual math learning. And before you know it, we had ongoing study groups. They were totally self-selected. The teachers valued coming together, sometimes as much as on a weekly basis. And then they started doing research in their classrooms. And then they started presenting their findings at national meetings. And then they were tapped by the school district to become coaches and professional developers for others. So on the school side, that's a way that it was enriching for the teachers. And then finally, for the children, to see the kids come into school every day, thrilled to be there, happy to learn, is a great joy, and it is enough. But it is even a greater joy when they come back in high school and say, I just happened to be passing by and I just want to show you my grades and I want to tell you about what I'm doing this summer. And they're so connected to the experience that they had growing up in a school from pre-K to 8 that I happened to be there one day when such a student came into Penn Alexander and sought out the principal to tell her these things. I felt so proud that we had launched this student who in any other circumstance would have floundered in the other neighborhood public schools. And here he was on the road to success.
That's fabulous. Love those kinds of stories. Nancy, you've had experience not only starting schools from scratch, but also working with existing low-performing schools to help improve them, strengthen them, and even transform them. What are the advantages and what are the pitfalls of investing in existing neighborhood schools, and can both types of efforts succeed?
I ask myself this often. They are different endeavors. They are equally important. And I feel equally compelled to put our resources and our energy toward modeling what a school from scratch could look like and modeling what a partnership with existing schools to help them succeed could look like. So the steps are much the same, and it has to do with relationship building in both cases. The resources are similar, and I say that from the perspective of our REACH model that Susan described briefly. We are focused in TCCS as well as in the other REACH partnership schools on teaching and learning, leadership, extended learning opportunities, parent engagement, early childhood education, and physical and mental health. Working with a new school, you have the opportunity to build it from scratch. Working with an existing school, you have the advantage of structures already in place, an array of specialists already in the school, a history in the school of how they've organized themselves to provide services, existing relationships with community organizations. So there's a lot of strength that already exists in a school when you come in as a partner. You have to, I find, I have to work harder and longer to build the trust so that we are seen as a long-term partner, that we plan the work together, that we determine what the metrics are going to be together, and then move it forward on whatever pace feels right for the school.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to some general questions, and as I ask them, I mean, whoever wants to just jump in, and then talk among yourselves, and I'll stand back a little bit or sit back a little bit. In her remarks, I mean, Susan acknowledged the donors and the foundations who have been our philanthropic partners for the work that Teachers College is doing in Harlem. I'm interested in hearing from all of you about what you would say to donors who are looking to have a transformational impact on urban public education. Right now, a lot of that money, particularly in places like New York, have been going to high-performing charter school networks. What is the case that you would make for supporting university-assisted public schools as a smart investment, or including that in the public school investment portfolio of foundations and donors?
Can we start?
Sure.
Well, I spend a lot of my time doing this, so and thinking about it. So it's a interesting topic for me. I think, first of all, we have to be the highest performing too. So it's not a competition with high performing. It's basically, can you create a model that has bigger reach? And so when we talk about scaling impact, most philanthropists are interested in what difference does it make? What difference is it going to make? And sometimes in the local community, but for all of us, we want our dollars to go as far as possible. So we've very carefully emphasized and actually articulated that we're a small school with a big footprint. And the big footprint is the impact that we have on other schools through what we learn at Henderson Hopkins, the impact that we have on education reform, our willingness to take what we know how to do and what we're using at Henderson Hopkins and get it as quickly out into the community as possible. And just one quick story. We have Success for All as one of our literacy programs that came out of Hopkins with Bob Slavin. And we were able to, and it's a foundational piece of the literacy program in the elementary school. So we were able to take Bob's work and make some philanthropic investments in the data systems that he uses to be, one of our commitments is to personalizing the experience for all of our students. And so he had a clunky data system. We got a philanthropist to donate to this data system. And it's not a sexy thing to do, to donate to a data system. But they saw the value in this, and we immediately were able to literally group and regroup kids in real time much quicker than he was able to do that using the data system that he had in place before. That immediately affected the 2,000 schools where he has Success for All. So 2 months later, we could go back to this donor and say, look, you made this commitment in Henderson Hopkins. 2 months later, we are using it in 2,000 schools around the country. So it's that level of impact that allows you to say things that happened here. And again, the analogy with the hospital has been easy for us to have. You know, Hopkins invented Whipple surgery, and you know, everywhere in the country does Whipple surgery now for pancreatic cancer. You know, so you can see you can tell a story about the expanding scope of the investment by proof of concept in your initial laboratory school or university-based school.
I guess I'll just say maybe give a few brief examples of ways that we've also sort of gone along the same sort of conversation. Because when we talk about scale, and particularly referencing what philanthropy has supported relative to charters, they just want like replicating a ton more charters. And that's not really, when we're talking about scale, that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about replicating ourselves for the sake of replicating ourselves. We're really talking about, as John indicated, you know, serving as that demonstration site to try some new and innovative practices. For example, we have a Learning Sciences Institute out of the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College of Education, and they have several researchers that are big on gaming theory and teaching certain strategies through gaming theory. And so we were that initial site where we really piloted a curricula that was to teach persuasive writing through gaming. And students had to read, but they also had to create an avatar that would then kind of go through the village, and it would ask questions of the villager that would help them build a more persuasive argument. And so when we piloted it, it wasn't exactly where it needed to be, but that helped inform that researcher on sort of the next level that particular curricula needed to be at, and now that's being used broadly across multiple school districts. So that's just an example of sort of the impact of having this university integrated connection in your school.
I would add to that too, that it takes that there are a lot of failures in
Yes.
this as well. You know, as we're telling you the success stories. I mean, you know, for every one of these successful outcomes, there are things that you've used as the school for a laboratory for that you rule out, you know, and so it informs the faculty as well that these aren't strategies that are feasible and or scalable because it's a great idea. We tried it here at a relatively low cost without implementing it in hundreds of schools, and there's still some work to be done. There's still questions to be answered. There's still issues around this particular area. So it informs both ways. I think we take the best of what we can and we scale it, but we also figure out, well, that was a bad idea, and we just drop that completely without, you know. So it is a place for this experimentation. At least our university in general are places for experimentation, and if and you have to be careful using the word experimentation, especially in some of the neighborhoods where we're working. But that's essentially what it is.
And I would just add also that, yeah, exactly that. I mean, before we entertain entering into a relationship on a particular research project or with a particular faculty member, again, it's about match, and we need to ensure that there's going to be value add both ways. And sometimes there is. I mean, all the time before we enter into it, everybody thinks that there is going to be that value add, but yeah, it doesn't always happen. Just one more example, with the Phoenix Elementary School District, we enjoy a good partnership, but just even on the sort of business model side of things, one of the things, and I know TCC does this, I'm not sure about Hopkins, but one of the things that we do with our teacher hiring process is we actually, besides having them sort of give us a writing sample, interview individually, interview with a panel, we also have them do a teacher demonstration before our students. And so our students are actually providing some input, but we also get to see if they're just, you know, talking the talk or if they can walk walk the talk. And that, because we had a panel of interviewees that included the Phoenix Elementary School District in that process, they then altered their hiring practices. And Phoenix Elementary School District is one of the oldest school districts in the city of Phoenix. In fact, it was the first public school district in the state of Arizona. But that's just another example. So sometimes it's done on the curriculum side, sometimes it's done on the business and operations side.
Nancy?
I think
Okay, good. Pretend I'm somebody else for a minute. I'm a special assistant to the president of a large urban university in the Midwest. And my boss calls me into the office and says, I'm reading about that fabulous work that Teachers College is doing in West Harlem and that Arizona State University is doing in Phoenix and Johns Hopkins University is doing in East Baltimore and starting up these university-assisted schools. And I think I want one of those too. So make it happen. So how and where do I begin to make it happen? Am I the one to make it happen? And by the way, did I tell you that my boss is really impatient to see results?
The first thing you should do is go back and ask him for a check. Because it's expensive. And I say that kind of in jest, but you really do have to look at the overall cost of doing this. There may be some efficiencies in the delivery, but for the most part, these turn into relatively expensive activities for universities. And then I think you also go back and you ask, where's the rest of the institutional commitment? You have to have a strong commitment from the president and the leadership of the university, not just a passing commitment. So you got to kind of, first of all, judge, is that a true commitment to doing this and understand what that commitment is. And then for us, it's meant engaging a broader sense of the university. If we try to do this just as a college of education, we wouldn't get very far. So it's engaging the other disciplines within the university and making it a truly wide university initiative. This has been one of the problems with early childhood laboratories, is that we really haven't reached out beyond, in many of those laboratories, to other areas as extensively as we can. It's easier when you get into K-8 and the upper grades to get other disciplines involved, but it's critical for sustainability.
So I would say that to get started, in addition to ensuring that there is a real and true and long-term commitment on the part of the institutional leadership within the university, the next step involves making sure that you've got solid partners both in the community and with your school system. And in terms of your impatient boss, my experience in Philadelphia and then in New York is that in each case it took us about 4 years from the point at which we said, we want to do this, to the point at which we had a deal and could open the school. So it's a long-term effort, but you have to put that work in up front. This notion that you can just turn around and open a school and everything is going to be fine puts you at considerable risk for promising more than you can deliver, for one thing. And if it is to truly be a university-assisted school as opposed to a faculty member's dream or a department's dream or even a school of education's dream, you have to know that you've got buy-in from across the system. And then with those partners in place, and including community partners, then you can march forward together, which is not to say that there won't be points of tension, and they could be considerable tension, but to try to do it alone as the university, you'll get killed in the process.
You could always point out that the current life of the presidency is about 5 years, so the next person is going to get credit for it anyway. So you're not going to get credit for it.
I would just add that in addition to, John spoke to some of the stakeholders on the university side that needed to be involved, as well as the cost model, being clear around what is a sustainable cost model for an endeavor like that. And Nancy pointed out the stakeholders on the community side, as well as the level of commitment and buy-in on the part of university leaders and other folks in and out of sort of the College of Education. I do think that what needs to be emphasized too in this scenario is that it will take some dedicated commitment and resource, and not just financial, but I'm just saying this can't be kind of an aside, you know, how a department or a division can manage multiple grants, a couple of different research projects at a time. It's that kind of work, it's that kind of effort and commitment where it really does designate somebody sort of writing herd on that, who has a level of support, because those challenges will arise, as Nancy mentioned, and sometimes, and ultimately you resolve through all of them, especially if you've got sort of all the right interests at play and all the right configuration of stakeholders that have bought in. But you do need somebody to write herd on this. This can't just be done as part of everything else that your department or your division already does.
My last question before I turn it over to our friends in the audience right now is getting back to my impatient boss, and David, you just touched on this, because 5 years my boss will be gone, and I guess so will I.
If you're the special assistant, you will.
And the person who preceded me knows very well about the vagaries of that as well. But I meant at Penn, to be clear. Presidents change, priorities change, cultures, you know, university cultures change, boards of trustees over time will have some turnover and changeover. So is there an approach or a formula in terms of involving the maximum number of stakeholders and partners that maximizes or improves the chances that the school that you start will still be there 2 presidencies down the road or 3 presidencies down the road?
Yeah, I'd like to maybe respond to that. I think there are 2 critical components. First is that you do need to ensure that you're working in a way that will institutionalize the school in that broader university environment. And so certainly there's integration of faculty, integration of curricula, integration of resources, but I'm really talking about really having an institutionalized presence, not unlike the rest of the colleges and divisions across the university. And in fact, we're fortunate enough in Arizona where at least a couple of our campuses are physically on the university campus. Our downtown campus is actually kitty corner to the downtown's campus of the university. And so we actually have students that are taking classes in the state-of-the-art science labs at the university. You know, they'll walk there for their classes, or they're taking their courses for credit. And so institutionalization, I think, is really key. And the more that that you have the buy-in across all different kinds of discipline, because what you're effectively doing is you're taking these kids before they are in college and you're introducing them to the disciplines, and they're really figuring out at that point in time what their interests might be. And so that's an added incentive, I think, for the folks across different disciplines to really be interested and invested in this type of program. So institutionalization of the school is my first sort of point. My second point is that, you know, you can't argue with results. And so once you've established a track record, you know, everybody wants to be part of a success story. And so it really, and that's kind of how we evolved. I will, you know, full disclosure, you know, admit to you that the first campus that opened, it was in the suburban neighborhood that I described, and those kids already came very well prepared, and so that school just, you know, got off to a really strong start. The turnaround school, on the other hand, got off to a little bit of a rocky start, not just, and I wouldn't say it was because of the kids, I think it was just the circumstances. It was already a failing school. My predecessor had passed away a month before the school was set to open, and there was just, you know, all kinds of things that just happened in that year. And so it had had lots of fanfare. It was a university school, and it was going to be terrific. And then it wasn't, and much more depressingly for a community that really needed it. And so it was really hard to recruit, you know, once myself and the folks that were involved at the time and continue to be involved, it's really hard to recruit interest in that it was going to be a new day, right? Because we'd always gotten some kind of a little bit of a false start. The minute we started performing, recruitment was not an issue. I mean, the minute that there was a track record of success, I mean, at this point, we've got a wait list that we can't respond to, unfortunately, because it's in excess of 500. But the, you know, success speaks for itself. And so I would say, of course, everybody intends on their endeavor being successful. But if you truly are, that in and of itself will institutionalize the enterprise.
I would just say quickly, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add that having written agreements is an important part of ensuring sustainability. And we have multiple agreements between Teachers College and the Department of Ed, between Teachers College and Columbia University. The Department of Ed has a written agreement with the Archdiocese of New York, which owns the land where the school sits. So all of this is written so that if leadership changes, you at least have a piece of paper that has memorialized the commitments. And in our case, there's also a written agreement between Columbia University and the West Harlem Development Corporation. So we're all tied up together in every possible way. That, coupled with a willingness or the availability or willingness to bring in the resources to make the schools work so that they do produce good results, those are some other aspects of making sure that it outlives its initiators.
I think you have to stay relevant, too. We need to remember that, and I love this, the tagline here, where the future comes first. You know, with the first one starting here in 1902, there were hundreds of these around the United States, you know, laboratory schools. They all became campus-based and irrelevant to the needs of the community and became more focused on faculty members. And so those that survived were early childhood centers, and many of those morphed into opportunities for faculty, highly supported faculty childcare across the country. So that's kind of the history of it. Right now we have a window of relevance because of the need in urban areas and the possibility that universities can fill some of those niches. But if we don't stay relevant in meeting the needs of the communities, we're going to, you know, they'll look like lab schools from the past, and they will go by the wayside. So I think the relevance and actually, and one of the strengths of the university is the ability to think towards the future and be a first mover in terms of innovation. But if we don't do that, they won't survive.
That's great. I'd like each of you, if you could, to just talk about the university's role of governance in your university-assisted schools. And Nancy, I know you just touched on this, and the importance of having agreements, but perhaps maybe describe the kinds of agreements that undergird your relationships with the school district or with the governing body right now, in terms of how governance is actually structured and operationalized.
Well, there are formal governance structures, and then there are the informal structures. So in our case, Teachers College Community School, as well as all the other schools in our partnership, are New York City Department of Ed schools, and we have a memorandum or memoranda of understanding between Teachers College and the Department of Ed that spell out what our role is, what authorities or what opportunities we have, what the obligations are of the school district, of the school, and of the university. So we start from a point where everybody has bought in to some of those formal roles. In the case of Teachers College Community School, our agreement gives us significant autonomy in selecting the curriculum, the school schedule, hiring of principal and hiring of staff, and formative assessments. So those things aren't rocket science. As long as we produce results, the Department of Ed doesn't have a lot of reason to, at least in today's times, to care how we get there. So we have identified the areas that are most important to us, and those are formalized. The informal governance is equally important, and that is the ability of the principal and the representative from the university to work very closely together. Unlike the charter arrangements or a contract arrangement, the principal does not report to me or to anybody at the university. her obligation to the university is all in that informal set of relationships. So there's another person who has to buy in. We make decisions together, but at the end of the day, it's a New York City public school, and we try to work our way within the formal written agreements to make sure that we get where we're trying to go.
Either one of you want to speak about, describe the way that governance is set up at your schools?
Sure. So in the charter context, we're our own 501c3, so therefore we have our own governing board. That said, because of the affiliation with Arizona State University, there are certain provisions in our bylaws that effectively say the president of the university or his or her designee must be involved in certain decisions. Some of it pertains to amending our articles of incorporation or our bylaws. Some of it pertains to approving the overall budget or getting annual budget reports. Some of it pertains to the hire of who's in charge, chief executive officer for the school. So even though it's its own 501c3 and has its own governing board, not all their decision-making authority is completely independent of the university. But it's also a way of not also necessarily taking everything that has to do with the school's operation to the university's board of trustees. And so that's effectively how we're set up. We do have an affiliation agreement with the university. We have a collaboration agreement, and these are all just contracts, with the Phoenix Elementary School District. We have contracts with the state retirement system. So to Nancy's point, there's lots and lots and lots of contracts. But effectively, the way we are governed is very autonomously. You asked about challenges and advantages and disadvantages. An advantage, certainly, of operating under a charter umbrella, at least in Arizona, is that there's an incredible amount of autonomy. The disadvantage would probably be the funding component, along with, within statute, university-sponsored charters. So in Arizona, universities can actually serve as the authorizer, the charter sponsor, as well as the charter holder. And so, because that's a relatively new advent in the legislation, there are still sort of, from time to time, little areas of Arizona's statutory provisions that weren't updated adequately, and so therefore we're not covered, and we have to go back and fix it and retro-apply it so that we will be covered. But by and large, so that would be a disadvantage. But operating as a charter entity, at least in Arizona or in a state that is very sort of pro-charter, has had tremendous advantages relative to autonomy.
We have a complicated structure, but the bottom line is the university has about $750,000 of operating in the whole project, and if we don't get to do what we want, we won't put the money up. And so you have a good bit of leverage over the formal structures when you have those kind of resources on the table, and it's critical that if you don't have that stake, if you don't have that much skin in the game, you're not going to get to call all the shots. And so, for us, putting that much skin in the game and distributing that bill across the university really gets buy-in from all units across the university.
A couple of questions. Number one, do you have a designated liaison within Teachers College or within your organizations that act as a go-between to help forge those relationships with the teachers at the public school system? Number one. Number two, if you are doing any type of joint fundraising for shared positions or shared resources, have you run into challenges with that? And you kind of touched on this a little bit. If I'm bringing the money to the table, I'm going to have the ownership and say in how that's governed. But if you're doing it together, how do you truly become partners in how that money is spent?
Go ahead.
I would just say that, yes, we do have a dedicated liaison, and it doesn't necessarily need to reside within the Teachers College. And you have a few examples here. In the case of TCC, that does reside in the Teachers College in Hopkins, but actually our school, we're in a different division of the university called Educational Outreach and Student Services, which has more to do with outreach and pipeline development. So yes, and then to the second question, relative to joint fundraising, I think it's just important in whatever agreements are established that you spell out what the rights are as they pertain to each party. Yes, we welcome that opportunity, and that's something that we're mutually interested in. But there, you can spell out kind of how you all want to share in that endeavor in the agreement in a real general way.
Yeah, well, I have an assistant dean that does nothing but this. and that's their job. And then on the resource side, most of our partners have very specific things that they're funding. And we don't have you rarely get generic kind of take this money and do good things.
Right.
Basically all of those are in the form of proposals for specific activities. So they govern the same way. They govern us with their investments in the same way. And if even though it's philanthropic, if we don't deliver, we don't get it again. And so that's the leverage point, is in getting things done the way you want them done.
And then I would say, for us here, I am the formal and official point person and liaison for the development of both TCCS and the rest of the REACH partnership, but I have a whole team of people who work on this, and some of them are here today. Audrey Cox was here.
She's back there.
Oh, Audrey Cox is our liaison on the ground at TCCS. She lives there, so she does a lot of the day-to-day back and forth interactions, supervising graduate students, helping with purchase orders, dealing with parents, turning in newsletters and all of that stuff. For our REACH partnership, my colleague Keisha Hayes is in the room, and she oversees all of the work that we're doing mostly with the 5 existing schools, while I spend more time on the one school, and she has a team of people working with her, an instructional specialist, an after-school specialist, and a parent specialist. All of this is externally funded, or almost all of it is externally funded. So there are not only the pressures of fundraising for the services in the schools, but even to create the infrastructure to allow it to happen. That said, we've been very successful at it. I think that our donors and our various funding sources understand what it takes to do this work. And when we apply for funding for the schools, similar to what Dave said, they're proposals and they have constraints on them, or they determine how the money's to be spent, or one entity applies as opposed to another, and we just have to formalize who gets to make the decisions.
Okay, my name's Felicia Peden. I'm with the Children's Museum of Memphis. And I wanted to know, I keep hearing you talk about your public schools or your charter schools. Do you have any schools that are tuition-based? And you also talk about schools where your teachers and instructors can take their children. Do you have any schools where the students can actually take their children, especially in Senator Klein and the education department? So is that even a consideration? And I also wanted to know, and you touched on it a little bit also, with me working on a children's museum, I think I heard somebody talk about a science center collaborative. Have you ever thought about creating a school on the campus of a science center or children's museum or entity like that?
We've had conversations with the Smithsonian about that, and they're still in conversations, but about a science-based approach at the Smithsonian, but we haven't done that. And we do have in Henderson Hopkins, the Early Childhood Center is half the kids are tuition-based, and the other half are early Head Start. So it's a blended funding stream, but half of them are full pay, $20,000 a year for infants and toddlers in the same classroom with early Head Start.
We don't charge tuition. Our enrollment process is non-selective, and so it's a lottery process, first come, first serve. With the exception of pre-K, we do have sliding scale pre-K, just because the pre-K tuition, we don't get any revenues from the state to fund pre-K, and so we need to make sure that that program can pay for itself, but we have, while we don't have Head Start, we have some support through a state-funded program to offer free to no cost pre-K for our neediest families. With regard to operating a campus on a particular cultural institution, I think that's something we'd certainly be open to. The biggest challenge, at least in the charter school context, is facilities. We don't get funding for capital, and so it would really be contingent on really understanding what that means, if we'd have the capacity to go out for bonds to fund something like that, or if there was some kind of relationship that could be brokered. But doing something on a cultural institution itself is not something that we would, I mean, I would imagine that's something we would welcome, provided that the programming could be supported in that context and the business model worked, right? So.
Similarly, we don't charge tuition for school. We're in the midst right now of working with the parent body on after-school programming, some of which Teachers College provides at no charge. But for parents who are looking for extended childcare services, we're working with them on how they can partner with community organizations. It's beyond the scope of what we provide at the school, and parents do pay fees for that, but we try to work together to keep those fees down. And we actually did look into the possibility of partnering with a cultural institution when we were first looking to create the school, and it had to do with, partly with space. If we could find a mutual niche for cultural institutions looking for space, and we were looking for space, if we could find a funding mechanism to make that happen, we would have been happy to do that. In fact, we went down a path for a while of sharing a facility with a Boys and Girls Club. But the finances are very tricky, and in the end, we just had to move on our own.
One of the challenges there too is that we as a profession of educators want it to look like a school, which is probably inappropriate and not necessary. But in conversations, we look at spaces and say, well, that doesn't look like a school, and so we need to really broaden our definition of where learning occurs and not try to create these settings. If we're really going to take advantage of science centers and museums, we have to reconceptualize what it means to be in school. And that's another conversation, but one that all of us need to have if we're going to take advantage of the assets that are within our community. We have to really break out of this concept that these are physically spaces that are classroom-based spaces, and that's harder to do than most of us imagine.
Yeah, and I would just add, just one final point, is that we can still, and we do in fact enjoy relationships with our cultural institutions, whether it's the Mesa Museum of Cultural Arts area or the Phoenix Children's Museum or the Arizona Science Center. And so even if we're not located there, I mean, our kids are there all the time. And furthermore, we've created these academic apprenticeship experiences for some of our older students from about middle and high school on up, where effectively they're exploring disciplines in early childhood or museum curation or art and design or STEM-related areas. And they actually intern there at those cultural institutions to get that exposure and determine if that's in fact a discipline that they would like to pursue.
David Steiner, Hunter College. David, I've had the privilege, thanks to you, of actually visiting Henderson Hopkins. And one thing that I think the audience might be interested in is you talked about the physical spaces outside, but you've designed with your colleagues an extraordinary physical space that has a philosophical boundary that is quite unlike a conventional school. And I think that would be of interest to talk a little bit. You talked about the creche, but not, for example, the very mature students you have.
Right. Yeah. So we did build a school that we think is going to be more aligned to the future, where we don't have enough fixed classrooms for students to be in fixed classrooms. There's a much more open flow, a challenging of grade boundaries. So we have houses of 120 students with 6 teachers, and those 6, starting in first and second grade, and those 6 teachers have to figure out how to use the spaces together, and they're using a data platform to do that. So in certain times of the day, you need 5 students together. Other times you need 30, and it's constant. The schedule can be adjusted much more the way we do in early childhood to the needs and interests in the student-centered. So a student-centered approach that's actually using data-driven decision-making about how to maximize performance, academic, social, emotional, physical, really requires very different spaces than we have now, which are fixed kind of one-to-many spaces. And in reality, schools are the only place where we continue to learn that way. Every other part of our life has become much more personalized and individualized. So the use of technology is limited by the way we've oriented these spaces. So we have combinations of large spaces, individual conference rooms, individual workstations, much like we see in our workplaces, in our corporate workspaces, where you actually use the space that is aligned to the function that you're trying to perform or the outcomes you're trying to accomplish. And so I think we have to think very carefully about the future of schools in relation to this. So thanks for bringing that up.
Eric Nadelstern, Teachers College, and in an earlier career, I was principal of a high school on a college campus for 17 years and understand the power of that relationship, but also how complicated it is and how much work goes into making it work. So I can appreciate the kinds of things that you're involved with. My question, though, relates to the message back to school districts. There's one teachers college in New York, one Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, one Arizona State in Phoenix. All three cities are places where significant numbers of students are not succeeding, and where school system leaders are looking for systemic approaches to try to improve student outcomes. Is there a lesson in this that is systemic that you'd like to see school superintendents walk away with?
I think there are a lot of lessons, not just for superintendents, but for the academy as well. You know, and again, it boils down to the effectiveness of the reach of these places is in the relationships that you're able to develop with districts, and the fact that, for example, the district, we were on a formal contract school with the district, but other schools ignored us in the first couple of years as we were getting the designs up. It wasn't until we opened this shiny new facility and that could actually have some proof points that we started to be able to build deeper and deeper relationships about how we would take what we're going to use here and expand it out into the community. So it was a combination of building those relationships, but we had to have some proof of concept early enough to actually seed those developing relationships and keep their attention for long enough, because districts tend to gravitate towards the newest, shiniest thing that they see, and we took advantage of being that for a short period of time. Now we just got to translate that into a relationship and a performance-based kind of an assessment of our outcomes that sustain it.
And I would say, well, first of all, I would just like to acknowledge, Eric, that in addition to having been a principal and now being a TC, in between that, he was deputy chancellor in the New York City Department of Education. So he knows a great deal about systemic change. My response to the question would be that there are pockets of innovation and great practice going on in every city. And it's not just, obviously, in the university schools or the lab schools. It's also in some of the regular public schools. And I think the challenge for us is to figure out, in any of our school systems, what is it we can learn from those pockets of excellence, and what are the underlying principles that could be applied in other places. I sometimes worry that it has a lot to do with the people, the particular people, and you can get the structures set up a certain way, but you also need the right people on the bus or in the building to make it happen. But I think there's a lot we could be learning from all of these different models, and we haven't done nearly a good enough job, generally speaking. In all the years that I was in Philadelphia with Penn Alexander, the school system there, by and large, said, well, we're not interested in that because it couldn't possibly be replicated. You have more resources, and we don't have universities. There aren't enough colleges and universities to do what you do. Therefore, what you're doing is irrelevant to us. And that, of course, hurts.
Yeah, well, and we feed that by gloating and being arrogant about the outcomes that we get. So we should perform much better than other public schools because of what we've put into it, the human capital, and something that we don't talk about a lot, which is motivational creaming of families and students. I mean, we actually, even though we have a lottery, our lottery pool is a lot stronger than the lottery pool 2 neighborhoods away where the parents didn't know there was a lottery, or they show up in November, won't know if school started yet. So the people that apply for our lottery in March, because it's a Henderson Hopkins lottery, is a different population of students. And so what we can't do, I know what we shouldn't do, is use our success to beat up other schools. We need to use our success to help other schools figure out what are critical elements of that. And part of the district and state's reaction to us is, well, you should be better because of what you've invested in it and your ability to put together the human capital that's necessary to make it happen.
If I may just interject here, aren't there some practical benefits that could accrue to neighboring schools and to the district, that radiate district-wide and beyond, even in terms of just professional development opportunities or ways of being able to disseminate some innovative curricula that aren't necessarily going to be dependent upon having university faculty and expertise on site at the school? So maybe all of you, each of you can speak to some of the practical benefits that do accrue to other schools and that can have a broader impact.
Well, I'd like to respond by saying I think, and it's certainly relevant, but I sometimes think that we're a little misaligned in our focus, because too often we are focusing on what's the magic bullet and what's the magic curriculum and what's the magic sort of leader and the magic this and the magic that. What we're really trying to demonstrate, which is why I brought up the geography of our schools, because I think that's really critical. What we're really trying to demonstrate is that all students can succeed and that all students are capable of being eligible and being successful in a four-year university. And so we're hoping through the demonstration of what's happening, given the sort of cross-representation of the populations of students that we serve, that people are going to take note. Too often, and I don't necessarily disagree, I mean, not everybody is meant for four-year university, but everybody should have the choice to go to four-year university, which is why our high school graduation requirements mirror that of the public university entrance requirements. I mean, plain and simple, who am I to decide what your path is going to be because I have some perception about your ability or your skill level? What we're really trying to demonstrate is that if you afford the support and put the expectation out there and push all of these kids in spite of their life circumstances to reach their highest potentials, they can all do it. And then fundamentally have at their disposal the maximum amount of choices that possible. And then when it comes to that time, they can decide to pursue four-year university or not, but they should at least be afforded the choice. Secondly, relative to what is possible in any kind of environment or setting and sort of addressing the critique of, well, it's only possible because you have all these extra resources, we are actually trying to nail down the formula. Like, what does it cost to successfully educate a student in an urban circumstance and a student in a suburban circumstance, and really make the case that this is what it's costed us. And you're going to see, actually, it's well within, and in fact, you get more per student, and it's all really a matter of how you direct those resources. And so that's something that we haven't quite, gotten the answer on yet, and it's something that we're continuing to assess, but we're hoping that it's through an example like that potentially, other school environments will see that there is an opportunity to do all of these things in their environments. And thirdly, is we are engaging in those conversations, both with traditional districts as well as charter schools relative to the whole advance when ready notion, meeting students where they're at, relative to preparing all students to be college eligible, et cetera. And so that's not something that we're doing in isolation of the school. And I absolutely agree. It's not about gloating what we're good at. In fact, I admit all the time, we've only scratched the surface, and this is what we've found to have worked, and we're still working on the things that aren't quite working yet, and we don't pretend to have all the answers. We do want to engage in a conversation, though, around the fact that all kids can achieve if sort of the right sort of expectation. It's more than expectation, but expectation's part of it, and the right pathway has sort of been set before them. So,
I would like to add that one way to make changes across a broader range of schools is to have schools work together. And that happens in different ways in different settings. In our case, our REACH partnership is currently 6 schools, and they work together. So we do professional development together, we do retreats together, we have a lot of cross-fertilization between the principals and the staff. And so we're trying to grapple with the problems, pairing people up and so forth. Now, that doesn't require a university. It's something that we believe in, but I'm sure it happens across a charter network, and it can happen across, in New York City, we have affiliation networks where all of the schools literally buy into a network structure where they are working together across schools. So it's yet another approach that can happen where we ought to be listening more to and visiting more and being side by side with others who are doing things that we can learn from.
From a lay standpoint, I'm wondering, how do you recruit your faculty? How do you get your staff for these various institutions? Is it more or less difficult? Do you have standards such as set by the public schools or the hybrid or the charters? Do you have other requirements? And how about the compensation for these people?
Two good questions. We draw from the city pool of talented teachers, but we also, have our own alumni who find us. So again, we have a built-in advantage because of those that we know of and can find. But they're hired by the district, and they get the same compensation. Ours get a bit more because we go all day and all year. So we're able to compensate them for a longer day and for more months in the summer. So in the end, they end up making more money, but it's on the same rate. And if you look at the length of the day that we're compensated for and the months of the year, once you translate that into all day and over the summer, it's a very different salary package for teachers.
For our teachers, we actually have a pretty liberal setup. They do need to meet federal requirements, which means they have to be highly qualified in the content area that they're teaching, but they don't necessarily need to be certified. And so what we've done is, relative to our teacher recruitment, is we use a teacher not just for a single position, but rather oftentimes they're highly qualified in both math and science, so they can teach a few different, or maybe they're highly qualified in two separate areas, and so we can really kind of make them go a long way. As an example, our athletic director is also teaches reading and is also our student dean, and so we really leverage his resource a much longer way. Relative to compensation, I would say if you look at it at a salary to salary basis when compared with traditional districts, we're competitive in that regard. That said, we do have a longer day for our teachers as well as a longer year for our teachers. Our philosophy is not based on per diem, so for those longer days and those longer years, they're not necessarily getting a per diem rate. They get a salary for a set amount of time, is in their contract, and they are awarded, though, based on performance. So every year they're up for a performance bonus, and on top of that, where this year our budget will allow to provide a performance-based increase to their base level salary. And so we're very much driven not by tenure, not by how long you've been with us, it's really based on performance, and there's kind of a complicated rubric around that. Finally, I will also say that one big incentive that we offer our teachers is they do get the tuition benefit for reduced tuition at Arizona State University, and really all three state public universities, NAU and U of A as well, Northern Arizona State University and University of Arizona. So that's another big sort of, I think, attraction to our compensation package.
We're right in the middle of our hiring season right now at Teachers College Community School, and every year, and we're hiring every year because we're adding grades every year, we tend to get between 300 and 400 applications for 2 or 3 positions. Now, that said, it doesn't mean that they're all highly qualified. So it's a long process. The kind of teacher who will do well at Teachers College Community School is a special person, somebody who's very committed to their craft, to interacting with the university, to working with their peers, to having research go on in the building, to being innovative and so forth. So as the principal likes to say, this is not the easiest teaching job you can get, and a lot of people in the end weed themselves out.
Us too.
I would like some clarification, Beatrix. You spoke of the elementary school district for the city.
You have several elementary school districts that then feed into their own middle schools, and then you have those middle schools that then feed into a few different high school districts, and so it's very sort of disaggregated. In the East Valley area, which is the suburban area I kind of described to you, you do have unified systems there, so a district will offer the full complement of pre-K through 12. And so that has presented some unique dynamics relative to recruiting, but again, once we got to the point where we were proving we had a track record of success to point to, and our own families, quite frankly, were our biggest advocates. That sort of became less of a relevant issue for us. But that's just how it's structured, is we've got non-unified and we have unified systems.
We have time for, we have their hand up.
Hi, Richard Messina from the University of Toronto Lab School. It's not really a question, but a build on to your response to the question about what are the benefits to other schools. All of you are speaking about really exploring what's possible. John Dewey's mandate for opening his lab school. And I think we're also saying without apology. And our experience at our lab school, we get many visitors every year. We don't look like a typical school. We don't necessarily operate like a typical school. But the feedback we're getting, and I'm sure you get, is that it's a model that teachers can see and relate to. You can read a journal, you can attend a workshop, but until you see what's possible with 3-year-olds or 5-year-olds or high school students, I think that's what inspires the teachers. And I think we can't underplay that value. So an opportunity for teachers to learn from teachers as opposed to, theory or something. So
Yeah,
thank you.
and we often refer to our work as a demonstration site, which is, rather than a lab school. We actually couldn't use the word lab school in the neighborhood because the connotations of being in a lab school run by Hopkins wasn't good. If you've read Henrietta Lacks, if you've read that, in fact, one of my neighbors within the last 6 months has said, I heard on the street, she was trying to discipline one of her children and said, if you don't straighten up, I'm going to take you up there and give you to Hopkins. This is in 2014. So, yeah, so demonstration, the use of demonstration, being able to see it in action, I think is a real value.
I think we have come to the end of our session, and it has flown by. I want to thank our 3 panelists. They are existence proofs of why it is a great joy every day for me to work in higher education. David Andrews, Beatriz Rendon, and Nancy Strime, thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for your participation and your questions and your attention.